What is happening?
The church held its breath. Seoul's Cathedral of St. Francis had never looked more beautiful. 300 white orchids climbed the aisle columns, like pale hands reaching for heaven. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the faces of generals, senators, and crime lords. Men who bowed to no one had bowed when Anne George walked through those doors. She stood now at the altar in white satin, her natural curls crowned by a silver tiara, hands clasped loosely in front of her, the way a woman holds herself when she is trying very hard not to shake. Across from her stood Yong-hoo, the heir of the Hu dynasty, the man the underworld called the Dragon of Seoul. The man who had looked at her 3 weeks ago and said, "You are the only thing in this world I would give all of it up for." His black suit was perfect. His rings caught the light. The serpent tattoo coiled around his left hand. The mark of the Hu bloodline, older than the empire itself, flexed as his fingers curled tight at his side. He looked nervous. She thought it was love. The priest smiled and opened his mouth. Yong-hoo drew a slow breath, closed his eyes for half a second too long, then looked at Anne, and whispered a name that was not hers. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was the loudest thing Anne had ever survived. 300 people heard it. She heard it in her chest. In the place where she had spent 2 years carefully unpacking her fear of being someone's second choice. In the place she had thought, finally, was safe. She did not cry. She looked at the man she loved. His eyes were open now, wide and wrecked, searching her face the way a drowning man searches for solid ground. His mouth was still forming words, an explanation, an apology, a reason. She turned away before he could give her one. Some wounds once opened cannot be apologized shut. The wedding reception was already poured. The champagne towers stood like glass cities. The Hu Empire's most powerful allies filled the grand ballroom below, waiting to toast the union that would change everything. Anne George did not go down to them. She went to the bridal suite, removed her tiara with both hands, and placed it on the vanity table with the careful precision of a woman setting down something she would never pick up again. Her suitcase, rose gold, half packed since the day she had moved her life across an ocean, for a man she believed had chosen her, sat, waiting in the corner as if it had always known. She left through the service stairs, no note, no call, no last look at the skyline of the city that had become her home. Only one thing remained on the bathroom counter when the maids came to clean. A single pearl earring, the mate gone with her into the night. Anne George had spent 2 years believing she was finally chosen. Chosen above family pressure, chosen above political alliances, chosen above the ghost of a woman everyone swore was dead. She had been wrong. Or so she believed. The Hu Empire mobilized within the hour. Every operative, every informant, every surveillance network the most feared criminal dynasty in Korea commanded. All of it turned toward finding one woman in a white dress. They found nothing. Not Yong-hoo's security network. Not the criminal syndicate that controlled half the peninsula. Not the man who had stood at that altar with a dead woman's name still burning on his lips. Anne George had vanished, as completely as if she had never existed. 3 years later, on a Tuesday evening in late October, Yong-hoo received a message. No sender, no text. Only a single photograph. Anne was alive. And in the photograph, standing behind her in a crowd, half turned, half hidden, but unmistakably, impossibly there, was the woman whose death had started all of this. The woman everyone believed was buried. Yong-hoo stared at that photograph for a long time. Then he set down the glass of scotch he had been drinking, reached for his phone, and began pulling on a thread that would unravel everything he thought he knew. About the night his empire had cracked down the center, because the name he had whispered at that altar, it had not been an accident. It had been a message, and someone had used his own voice to send it. If this story found you, you already know you need to find out what that name meant, who staged the death, who engineered the altar, and whether Anne will ever let him explain. The truth is buried in an underground casino beneath Seoul, and it is darker than anything Yong-hoo was. Or like, share, subscribe so the story follows you. The ballroom did not know yet. That was the thing Anne could not stop thinking about as she descended the service stairs. Her satin gown gathered in, both fists, her tiara already gone, her heels silent against the concrete steps. 3 floors below her, 300 people were still seated at tables dressed in white and gold, still lifting glasses, still waiting for the bride and groom to descend the grand staircase and begin the rest of their lives. The band had started playing. She could hear it through the walls. By the time the first whispers reached the ballroom, Anne was already through the kitchen, past the startle line cooks, and out through a delivery exit that opened onto a rain-slicked alley behind the cathedral. The October air hit her bare shoulders like a warning. She did not stop. She turned left, then left again, away from the valet line, away from the black SUVs with Who family plates, away from the city that had never entirely been hers. She flagged a cab 3 blocks east. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror. White gown, no coat, no luggage, the particular stillness of a woman who has just made an irreversible decision, and said nothing. Some fares you do not ask about. She gave him an address on the other side of the Han River. Then she looked out the window and watched Seoul dissolve into rain. The search began within 20 minutes. Young had stood frozen at that altar for exactly 4 seconds after Anne turned away. 4 seconds that the security footage would later show as the longest stillness a man like him had ever displayed in public. And then something in his face had closed, not hardened, closed, the way a city seals its gates when it knows what is coming. He had walked out of the ceremony hall without a word to the priest, the guests, or the row of Who family elders, whose expressions ranged from fury to satisfaction. He had gone directly to his head of security, a man named Baek, who had served the Who family for 19 years, and had learned to read young Who's silences the way sailors read weather. Find her. That was all he said. Baek had nodded and turned away, and within the hour the Who network, 43 operatives across Seoul, cameras tapped into 6 city districts, informants embedded in every major transport hub, was looking for one woman in a white wedding gown. They found the cab driver by midnight. He told them where he had dropped her. They found the address, a small hotel near Dongjak, and they found the room, and they found the rose gold suitcase open on the bed with several items removed. And they found the bathroom where a faint trace of her perfume still hung in the air like a question. They did not find Anne. She was already gone. By morning, Yong-hoo stood in that hotel room alone, his jacket off, his rings still on, and looked at the space where she had been. The maids had not yet come. The suitcase was still there, a hairpin on the nightstand, a charging cable still plugged into the wall, the phone it belonged to nowhere in sight. He picked up the hairpin, held it, set it down. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the Han River in the gray morning light and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be powerful enough to control an empire and completely unable to reach the one thing he wanted. People spoke about Yong-hoo the way they spoke about weather, not as something that could be reasoned with, only anticipated and survived. He had taken control of the Who criminal dynasty at 24, 2 years after his father's death, and 1 year after the internal war that had nearly split the family in half. He had walked into that war with no weapons and no allies, only the particular quality of stillness that the most dangerous men carry, the kind that makes a room go quiet not because of what they have done, but because of what they are clearly capable of. He had ended the war in 11 days. No one who had been present for those 11 days discussed them afterward. What was known was that when it was over, the 3 men who had challenged his succession were gone. The family elders had fallen into line with the kind of deference that is not respect so, much as recognition, and Yong-hoo had taken his seat at the head of the Who empire, with the expression of a man who had simply done what needed doing, and found it neither satisfying nor particularly interesting. By 27, he controlled construction contracts across 4 districts, a private port operation on the western coast, and the kind of political relationships that never appear in public but determine everything that happens in private. By 29, the word that appeared most often in conversations on him was not dangerous, not ruthless, not even feared. The word was inevitable. What the city did not know, what almost no one knew, was that beneath the architecture of that empire, behind the stillness and the reputation and the rings on his fingers, Yong-hoo carried a grief he had never once allowed himself to fully feel. Her name was Ji-so. She had been 22 when they met, a graduate student in art history, who had wandered into one of his family's legitimate gallery openings and spent 40 minutes standing in front of a painting that everyone else in the room had walked past without stopping. He had watched her from across the room and felt something shift in him that he did not have a name for. He had introduced himself. She had looked at him without the particular wariness or calculation he was accustomed to seeing and said simply, "Do you actually like this painting, or do you own it?" He had laughed. He could not remember the last time he had laughed. They were together for 2 years. It was the closest he had come to a life that was not constructed around power. Something quieter, something that had air in it. She knew what he was. She stayed anyway. He was not sure he ever understood why, but he had stopped questioning it because questioning it felt like tempting something. Then she was gone. A car accident on a mountain road in Gangwon province, 3 years before his wedding day. They had been separated for 6 months by then. She had left quietly, the way good people leave impossible situations, without drama and without blame. But the news had arrived like a door slamming shut on a room he had not realized he still wanted access to. He had not grieved publicly. He had not grieved privately. He had simply continued, which was the only thing he knew how to do. The Empire did not pause for grief, so neither did he. Anne came into his life the way most things that matter arrive, sideways, through a door he was not watching. It was 18 months after Jisoo's death, at a private dinner hosted by a trade minister in the Hanam district. Yong-hoo had attended out of obligation and was already calculating his exit, when the commotion started near the entrance. Raised voices, a chair scraping back, the particular quality of tension that precedes violence. He had been on his feet before anyone else registered what was happening. A man with a concealed weapon was moving toward him through the crowd. He saw it the way he saw most threats, a half-second before it became undeniable, and he was already turning when someone stepped between them. Not a bodyguard, not an operative. A woman in a dark green dress who had apparently decided that the most reasonable response to a man reaching for a weapon in a crowded room was to step directly into his path and drive her elbow into his forearm with the precise efficiency of someone who had done it before the gun hit the floor. Baek's men were on the attacker in seconds. The room erupted. The woman in the green dress took a step back, brushed down her sleeve, and looked at Yong-hoo with the expression of someone who had just done something mildly inconvenient and was already thinking about what came next. She said, "You should probably not stand near windows for the rest of the evening." He had looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" "Anne George." She said it the way people say their name when they are not yet sure whether they are glad to have given it. "I'm a security consultant. I was hired by the minister." A pause. "You're welcome." He had smiled. It was not something he did often, and he was aware it surprised people. "Can I buy you a drink?" "You can," she said, "if you move away from the window first." What followed was not simple. Nothing involving Yong-hoo was ever simple. But Anne was not a woman who had come to Seoul looking for simple. She had come from Lagos at 26 with a graduate degree in risk management and a particular talent for walking into rooms full of dangerous men and being the most competent person in them without making anyone feel diminished by it. She had built her consultancy contact by contact, reputation by reputation, in a city that had not been waiting for her and did not particularly welcome her, and she had done it without apology and without softening herself into something more palatable. She was not naive about what Yong-hoo was. She had done her research before that minister's dinner. She knew the shape of his empire, the rumors attached to his name, the kind of loyalty he commanded, and the kind of fear that produced it. She had taken the drink anyway. They had talked until the restaurant closed. He had called her the next day, and the day after that. He was not a man who pursued things uncertainly. When he decided something mattered, he moved toward it with the same directness he applied to everything else. But with Anne, there was something different in the pursuit, a quality of attention, as though she were something he was trying to understand rather than acquire. She made him explain himself, not his empire, not his power himself. What he thought, what he felt, what he wanted when the meetings ended and the city went quiet. It was a question no one had asked him since Jisoo, and he had not realized until Anne asked it how much of himself he had quietly filed away in the years since. He told her things he had told no one else. She told him things that made him understand she was trusting him with them, which made him careful with them in a way he was careful with very little. 6 months in, her consultancy received a contract that would have required her to relocate to Singapore. She turned it down. She had not told him she was going to. She told him after. He had looked at her across a dinner table and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Anne, I know," she said again. Quieter. And he understood that she was not asking for anything in return. She had simply made a choice, the way she made all her choices, clearly, and without performance. He had reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The serpent tattoo on his fingers lay against her knuckles. She did not pull away. The wedding had been planned for 14 months. 14 months of security assessments and family politics and the particular exhaustion of two powerful worlds, being asked to make peace with each other long enough to witness a ceremony. The Hu family elders had not been welcoming. Several had been openly hostile, not to Anne personally, but to the idea of Anne, to the disruption she represented, to the precedent of the heir marrying outside the networks of alliance and obligation that had governed Hu succession for 3 generations. Yong-hu had met their objections with the same stillness he brought to everything. "She is who I have chosen," he said. "The discussion is finished." It was not finished. It continued in hallways and private meetings, and the kind of carefully worded concerns that are really ultimatums dressed in deference. His uncle, Hu Jae-won, the elder statesman of the family, the man who had nominally guided the empire during the 2 years between Yong-hu's father's death and Yong-hu's own consolidation of power, was particularly persistent. Jae-won was a man who smiled warmly and meant nothing by it, whose every conversation was a negotiation, and whose every gift came with weight attached. He had taken Yong-hu aside 3 weeks before the wedding. "I only want what is best for this family," he had said. "I know what you want," Yong-hu had replied, and walked away. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and cold, the sky pressing low over Seoul as if it were paying attention. Anne had dressed in a suite on the cathedral's upper floor, surrounded by 2 of her closest friends, women she had known since Lagos, who had flown in for this, who had done her hair and fastened the tiara, and told her she looked like someone the city would remember. She had looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She had felt for the first and last time that morning completely certain. Downstairs, in a private room off the main corridor, Yong-hu was alone for exactly 7 minutes before the ceremony. Baek stood outside the door. His suit was perfect. His rings were on. He was thinking about the speech he would give at the reception. Not the formal remarks, but the real ones. The things he had been trying to find words for since the night Anne had turned down Singapore for him, without asking for anything in return. Then the door opened. Not Baek. One of Jae-won's men, a figure Yong-hu recognized but had not expected, who stepped inside for only a moment, placed something on the table, and left without a word. It was a photograph. Yong-hu looked at it. The room did not change. The sounds outside did not change. But something inside him went completely still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not controlled, not chosen, but the involuntary stillness of a person whose understanding of reality has just shifted beneath their feet. The woman in the photograph was Ji-so. She was alive. She was standing on a street he recognized in a city he could place, and she was looking directly at the camera. And the photograph was dated 4 days ago. He stared at it for the remaining minutes before Baek knocked on the door and told him it was time. He walked to the altar. He stood across from Anne, who was luminous and certain in her white satin, who looked at him with the full weight of 2 years of chosen trust. The priest began. Yong-hu tried to find his way back into his own body, back into the room, back into the moment that was supposed to be the first moment of a different kind of life. The priest asked him to repeat his vows. He looked at Anne. He opened his mouth, and the name that came out was not hers. It was barely a sound, a breath. Something that had been living in a locked room for 3 years and had found the only door left open. But the cathedral was silent, and 300 people heard it. And Anne heard it in the place where she kept the things she was most afraid of. She stood perfectly still for one moment that contained everything. 2 years of love, a tiara on her head, the sound of her own worst fear spoken aloud in a church full of witnesses. Then she turned, and she walked. And by the time Yong-hu reached the altar steps, she was already gone. If you need to know whether she ever came back, like, share, and subscribe. The story is only beginning. She became someone else the way careful people do, not all at once, but in layers, each one placed deliberately over the last until the original was something only she could find, if she pressed hard enough in the right place. She had crossed into Japan by ferry 2 days after the wedding, using a passport she had obtained through channels her security consultancy work had made available to her. Not illegal, not exactly, but the kind of document that asked no questions and left no trail that a Hu family operative would find in the first sweep. She had gone to Osaka, then to a smaller city further south, and then to a coastal town that appeared on no list of places anyone would think to look for a woman who had vanished from a Seoul cathedral in a white gown. She cut her hair. Not dramatically. She was not trying to perform a transformation, only complete one. She found work consulting remotely for a risk firm based in London that had hired her twice before and did not require her physical presence. She rented a small apartment with large windows that looked out over water. She did not contact anyone from her life in Seoul, not her friends, not her clients, not the two women who had flown from Lagos to do her hair, and who had sent her 17 unanswered messages before going quiet in the way that good friends do when they understand that silence is the only thing being asked of them. She ran every morning along the coastal path. She cooked her own meals. She read. She worked. She built with the same methodical competence she had always applied to everything. A life that was small enough to be manageable and quiet enough to allow the loudest parts of her to gradually stop screaming. She did not think about Yong-hoo. That is what she told herself, and it was true in the way that all carefully maintained things are true. Through effort, through routine, through the daily discipline of not opening a particular door. What she did think about, in the hours before sleep, when the discipline loosened, was the look on his face in that single second before she turned away. The wreckage in his eyes, the way his mouth had still been moving, forming something she had not stayed to hear. She had told herself, in those early months, that it did not matter what he had been about to say. She was no longer entirely sure she believed that. Yong-hoo did not stop looking for her. This was known within the family, the way all of his decisions were known. Not because he announced them, but because the resources deployed made it obvious. Operatives were redirected. Budgets were reallocated. Baek, who had been with the family for 19 years and had learned to carry out instructions, without commentary, carried these out without commentary. The search was methodical. It was also, for the first time in Yong-hoo's operational life, unsuccessful. Anne had not left a trail. Whatever skills her consultancy work had given her, the knowledge of how searches were conducted, where records lived, which systems communicated with which, she had applied to her disappearance with the same precision she applied to everything. Each time his team found a thread, it led to a deliberate dead end. Each time they identified a possible location, the location was already cold. 6 months in, one of his analysts had put a report on his desk that concluded, professionally and with evident discomfort, that they were looking for someone who did not want to be found, and who was better at not being found than they were at finding. Yong-hoo had read the report, set it down, and told Baek to expand the search parameters. The years did not soften him in the way grief is supposed to soften people. He continued to run the empire with the same exactitude, attended the meetings, made the decisions, exercised the kind of authority that required no performance because it was entirely structural. He was the who heir, and the who heir's word was the shape of the world inside the family's reach. He did all of it. But something in the quality of his attention had changed. There was a photograph on his desk that had not been there before, not the photograph of Jisoo. He had locked that away the night of the wedding, in a place where it could not become something he looked at. The photograph on his desk was older, taken 14 months before the wedding, at a rooftop dinner above the Han River. Anne was looking slightly away from the camera, her curls loose around her shoulders, the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth. The smile of a woman who has just said something she found privately amusing, and has not yet decided whether to share the joke. He had taken the photograph himself. He did not explain it to anyone who came into his office. No one asked. The message arrived on a Tuesday in late October, 3 years and 11 days after the wedding. No sender, no accompanying text, only an image file, sent to a private number that fewer than 12 people in the world possessed. He opened it. Anne was standing at a market stall, outdoor morning light, a city he did not immediately recognize. She was in dark clothes, her hair shorter now, her posture carrying the particular ease of a person who believes themselves unobserved. She was looking at something off to the left of the frame. Her expression was calm. She was alive. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the background, at the crowd, at the faces moving through the frame with the incidental randomness of strangers in a market. And then he saw her. Half-turned, positioned 3 bodies behind Anne and slightly to the right, partially obscured by a market canopy. But the jawline was distinctive. The way she held her shoulders, the particular angle of a face he had memorized once in a different life. Jisoo, not dead, not gone. Standing in a market in a city 3 years after the car accident in Gangwon province that he had been told by people he had trusted, had taken her life. He set the phone down on his desk, picked it up again, stared at it for another long moment. Then he called Bake. "Find me that city," he said. "Find me that market. Find me that date." The answer came back within 4 hours. Busan, 8 days ago. They were on a plane before midnight. They did not find Anne in Busan. They found Ji-so. She was living under a name that was not hers in an apartment in a quiet residential district near the water. She answered the door when they knocked, which told Young-hoo something immediately. She had been expecting this, or something like it, for long enough that the arrival of it had produced not panic, but a kind of exhausted relief. She looked older, not in a way that surprised him. 3 years had passed, and she had apparently spent them in circumstances that were not comfortable. She looked as though she had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had learned to walk normally under its weight. She stood back from the door and let them in. She said, "I wondered when you would find me. I wasn't sure whether to hope for it or not." He sat across from her in the small living room and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Tell me," she told him. It came out in the careful, sequential way of someone who has rehearsed a confession, not because they planned to give it, but because they have lived with it long enough that it has organized itself into the only shape that makes sense. She told him about the accident, which had not been an accident, about the car that had driven her off that mountain road, about waking up in a facility she did not recognize, tended by people she did not know, and being told with quiet clarity that she was dead now, officially and paperwork confirmed, and that her continued comfort depended on remaining so. She told him about the man who had given those instructions. Young-hoo's expression did not change. "My uncle," he said. It was not a question. Ji-so looked at him steadily. "He came to see me once in the first year," she said. "He told me that you were dangerous for me, that he was protecting me, that the family could not afford the complications." A pause. "I don't think he believed any of it. I think he simply wanted a piece of leverage he could keep in reserve." "For what? For you." She said it plainly. "Everything Jae-won has ever done has been for the purpose of positioning himself closer to what your father built. He didn't want to destroy you. He wanted to own you. A grief he could activate, a wound he could reopen at the right moment." Her eyes were steady on his. "The photograph at the altar. He had someone deliver it to you. He chose that morning deliberately." Young-hoo sat very still. He was thinking about 11 days. About the war he had ended at 24. About the smile his uncle had given him at the wedding. Standing in the front row of the family section with his hands folded, and his expression arranged into something that looked like pride. "And Anne," he said. Ji-so's face changed. After she left the wedding, his people followed her. Not to harm her. He wanted her isolated, frightened, gone. If she came back, she would ask questions. If she asked questions, the photograph becomes a problem, a breath. But she's been safe. I made sure of it. I have been watching her for 2 years, Ji-so said quietly, from a distance. Whatever Jae-won's people knew about her location, I made sure they received conflicting information. Enough noise that they couldn't act. She looked down at her hands. I know that doesn't account for the wedding. I know it doesn't fix what happened, but she is safe. She has been safe. Young-hoo stood up slowly. He walked to the window. Outside, Busan carried on the ordinary business of an afternoon. Traffic, voices, the distant sound of water. The world continuing with the same indifference it always showed to private devastations. "Where is she?" he said. Jisoo told him. He went alone. Baek had argued against this, which was his right and his job, and Young-hoo had listened to the argument and then told him to stay in Busan and begin the process of locating his uncle, which would keep him occupied and was also what needed to happen next. Anne was in a coastal town 2 hours south. He drove himself. He found the apartment building. He sat in the car outside it for a while, which was not something he typically did. He was not a man who prepared himself for things, generally, because preparation implied doubt, and doubt was not a luxury the head of a criminal empire could afford. He was doubting now, not whether to go up, whether she would let him explain, whether an explanation was something she wanted, whether the 2 years she had built for herself in this quiet place had become something she preferred to whatever he was arriving to offer. He went up anyway. She answered the door in dark clothes, her shorter hair, the same posture she had always carried, upright, self-possessed, the bearing of a woman who had decided a long time ago not to make herself smaller as a courtesy to anyone. She looked at him. He had prepared nothing to say. This was perhaps the most honest he had ever been. She said, "How did you find me?" "Jisoo," he said. Something moved across her face. "She's alive," Anne said. It was not quite a question. Yes, a silence. She did not step back from the door. She also did not close it. "Tell me," she said. Her voice was even. The voice of a woman who had built herself back up from something very difficult, and was not going to be undone by a single word, but was also, he could see, listening with every part of herself. He told her. They took what he had learned to the authorities. Not the police, not the kind of institutional structure that would move slowly and leave room for a man like J1 to apply pressure and redirect outcomes, but the particular tribunal of consequence that exists within a criminal empire when its head has been deceived by one of its own. His uncle had understood this was coming. Men like J1 always understood when the tide was turning. It was what had kept him operational for 30 years. He had prepared contingencies. He had moved funds, shifted alliances, called in obligations from the various senators and ministers who believed themselves untouchable as long as the Hu family umbrella remained extended over them. He had gone to ground in a facility that Yong-Hu recognized immediately when his people identified it. An abandoned underground casino in a district that had once been a center of his father's operations. A place that appeared on no current map and on no official record, that the family had quietly maintained for years as the kind of location that might someday prove useful. It proved useful now. The confrontation inside it was not the kind that appears in accounts of these things. There were no speeches. Jae-won, when Yong-Hu found him in the casino's lower level, surrounded by men who had made the rapid calculation that their loyalty's market value had just collapsed, did not attempt to justify himself in the way that guilty men sometimes do when finally cornered. He sat in a chair and looked at his nephew and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I built this family as much as your father did." "You did," Young-soo said. "I deserved." "What you deserved," Young-soo said quietly, "and what you will receive are the same thing." The men around Jae-won made the calculation they had been about to make. They stepped aside. Anne was waiting outside when it was over. She had not asked to come in. She had also not been willing to wait at a distance. She had driven herself to the district, parked where Baek directed her, and stood in the cold air of the underground entrance with the patience of a woman who had waited 3 years and could manage another hour. When Yong-Hu came out, he looked the way people look when something that has been wrong for a very long time has finally been set right, not relieved exactly, not triumphant, but emptied of something that had been taking up space. He stopped when he saw her. She looked at him in the low light of that underground entrance, his rings, his tattoos, the serpent on his hand that had once felt like a symbol of everything complicated, and now felt simply like part of a man she knew. And she said, "Is it finished?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. He took a breath. "Anne." He said her name the way he had been unable to say it at that altar, fully, clearly, with the weight of everything it meant. "I need you to know that the name I said was not." "I know," she said. "I need to explain, Yong-Hu." She said his name with the particular steadiness she had always brought to the things that mattered. "I know," Jisoo explained. "I understood." A pause, and in the pause he could see the 2 years she had carried. The coastal apartment, the morning runs, the careful construction of a self that did not depend on being anyone's first choice. Understanding something and healing from it are not the same thing. "No," he said, "they're not." "I'm not finished healing," she said. He was quiet. "But I'm also not finished," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him, with the full weight of who she was, what she had survived, what she had built when the thing she had trusted most had broken beneath her feet. She had not rebuilt herself into softness. She had rebuilt herself into something clearer, something that knew its own edges. "I'm not making any promises tonight," she said. "I'm not asking for any." "Good." She pulled her coat closer against the cold air. "Then take me somewhere warm, and tell me everything you should have told me 3 years ago." He nodded once, and they walked out of that underground place together, into a city that was still going about its business, into an October night that was cold and clear and entirely open, and behind them the last of what J1 had built in shadow began its quiet collapse. Some things once exposed to the truth cannot survive it, and some things, the right things, cannot be destroyed by anything less. Here is the final call to action, written in the same tone and style as the rest of the story. Anne George stood at that altar and lost everything she thought she had chosen. She rebuilt herself in silence, in a city no one could find her in, with nothing but her own hands and her own will. And when the truth finally came, not as an apology, not as an excuse, but as the full, ugly, complicated weight of what had actually happened, she did not run from it. She stood in it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Anne George's story is far from over.